Hello, doctors. I'm Dr. Chris Rapoff of QME Continuing Education, and welcome to this week's presentation. I'd like to preface this by telling you that this information was taken from the textbook of musculoskeletal disorders in the workplace, 1997 textbook, and this chapter was authored by James Chafin, and we're speaking of postural considerations and lifting limits. So today I'd like to tackle this topic and just discuss some major implications in the world of workers' compensation, namely the postural considerations and limits of lifting as it applies in the workplace. Unfortunately, as qualified medical examiners, we're confronted with the repercussions of the workers' compensation improper posture when lifting and the resultant injury that occurs as a result of that. So let's get started. So postural problems during lifting can be attributed to the position of the hands to grasp, to move, and to position objects in the workplace. So the National Institute of Occupational Health and Safety lifting guides emphasize the importance of a compact object and close hand-to-body positions to minimize the biomechanical stresses on the back and the shoulders. However, technical and economic limitations in most industries often don't provide optimal conditions for lifting. Objects are often presented at floor level or on a low shelf. Lifting to or from a shelf above shoulder height can cause flexing and twisting of the torso, resulting in high moment loadings on the back and the shoulders. So to control the risk of low back pain, training workers on safe lifting techniques must be effective if the working conditions allow the recommended techniques to be used. Today we're going to touch on the various lifting scenarios to illustrate the biomechanical effects of hand location when objects of varying heights are lifted. The biomechanical effects of hand location on lifting objects of varied weight illustrated, and they're using the University of Michigan's 3D static strength prediction program with predicted L5S1 compression force and expected static strength percentages for each scenario. There are quite a bit of information here, so I hope you follow along. The first scenario we're going to be discussing are lifting objects from the floor. And when an object is to be lifted and it is on the floor, there's too often a person must locate the hands under the object, for example, at floor level, just to lift it. So if the object is small enough to be lifted between the knees, then a person can lower the hands to the floor level by assuming many different postures. There are two extreme postures are really useful to consider. One is the very common stoop lift, which you see on the left, wherein the knees are nearly straight and the hips are flexed. This allows the torso to lean forward to below horizontal as seen. Now this depicts this posture here. In contrast, if a person has the necessary ankle and knee flexibility, the hands can be lowered to the floor by using the deep squat as depicted on the right. In this particular depiction here, on the left-hand side, you can see that the hands are assumed to be about 9 inches horizontally in front of the ankles, with the fingers under the object while applying a vertical in-force. Two different object weights were used for reference, a 25-pound and a 50-pound object. The results indicate that the predicted back compression forces were really very different. Because of a larger and heavier body segments, the predicted compression forces for males performing a 50-pound weight are higher than 760-pound L5S1 disc failure limit referenced by the NIOSH, regardless of whether a stoop or a squat posture was adopted. It really is interesting to note here that for both males and females, the predicted AP disc shear forces are lower in the deep squat lift posture than in the stoop lift posture as you see. Although the shear forces have been proposed by some to be an important low back pain risk factor, the estimates of their values and their corresponding risk levels really weren't well documented. So what happens to lifting when an object on the floor is too bulky to easily fit between the knees, or it's located behind a barrier that restricts getting the object as close to the feet? In a situation where a larger horizontal distance exists between the ankles and the hands, there could be some problems there as well. So to illustrate this problem, let's assume that this 25 to 50 pound object located at the hands at the beginning of the lift are now 18 inches in front of the ankles instead of 9. Placing the hands in the position maintaining balance while developing required lifting force can only be accomplished by assuming a posture that is a semi-squat and stoop posture, as illustrated on the right. This requires that the buttocks be positioned posterior to the ankles, as you see, and providing a backward moment about the feet to counteract the forward moment by the upper body mass and the load being lifted. However, this comes with a problem. Unfortunately, this posture removes the lower part of the back away from the load being lifted and results in a higher predicted L5S1 disc compression force depicted on the right. So in this posture, lifting even a 25-pound object becomes questionable and could place someone at risk. How can we address this? Possibly if the object can be pulled in and lifted, as opposed to just being lifted vertically, the load moments and the resulting spinal compression forces will be reduced. And these lifting motions can only be accomplished if there are no barriers to prevent a person from pulling an object in close to the body when they lift. The second scenario we're going to discuss is lifting to high shelves. The task of lifting objects to a high shelf is pretty common in the workplace. And the primary reason for this scenario is the cost of the floor space in the workplace, which is normally very high and rising. Both in 1981 and the revised 1991, the Occupational Safety and Health Guidelines, they penalize lifting objects to high shelves. From a biomechanical perspective, there are at least two issues here. First is the shoulder and the arm strength limitation that exists when an object is lifted to a shelf above shoulder height, or they consider that about 60 inches. Problem is illustrated here on the left and the right for 25 and 50 pound objects. In the high close lift on the left, you can see that the fingers remain under the object being lifted throughout the lift. This hand posture forces the arms to be raised and abducted at the shoulders. Now, a smaller person with more abduction required and hence less strength capacity could be an issue. So to use the arm abduction strength, the grip is often released for an instant during the lift, and the fingers then slid to the side of the objects during the lift. This may be also necessary to avoid hitting the fingers against the front of the shelf when an object is set down. Now, this is called regrasp, and as this regrasp occurs, an unknown dynamic inertial loading force may be present. This leads to the second issue when we have these high lifts. The needed regrasp during the lift may cause the object to slip and fall, possibly injuring the feet, or maybe dynamically overload the back. Now, this actual scenario is particularly relevant in the high shelf is horizontally distanced from the lifter because of the barrier. For example, another lower protruding shelf, a table, bench top, or a conveyor. Now, this situation is depicted on the right. In this case, the hands are positioned on handles. However, the arms do not need to be abducted at the termination of the lift, as you see on the left side. This lessens the shoulder strength problem, although it's still a major concern for a 50-pound object. Obviously, only 60% on average of women predicted to be able to lift a 50-pound object in the posture shown on the right. The large horizontal action location, for example, inches from the ankles, on the right side creates a much greater predicted back compression force than predicted on the left. So if a dynamic force is superimposed on this static compression force, this could present a significant risk of injury to the lower back region even in an erect posture. So there is a need to ensure that the higher shelves are not horizontally distant from the lifter, and a well-designed handles are provided on heavy and bulky objects if at all possible. On to the third scenario, lifting objects to the side. So if a person needs to carry an object for a long distance, particularly on uneven terrain or up or down stairs, it's helpful if the object can be carried on their side or at their side so it doesn't interfere with their leg motion or their vision moving forward. If the object has a handle on it, for instance, luggage, and is tall, for example, 15 to 25 inches, and narrow, maybe less than 9 inches, it greatly facilitates the lifting and carrying activities. But on the other hand, what if the object has no handle and is bulky? And assume that the object is on or near the floor and under a shelf or a bench. Let's add all the scenarios here. In this situation, to avoid interference with the front of the shelf or a bench, a person must attempt to do a side lift. This is depicted here in the figure. Now, to perform this type of lift, a person must stoop first and twist the torso to the side so that the shoulder is over the object. This allows one arm to extend around the far side of the object and the other arm to cross over the legs to the near side of the object. Now, the postural options available are limited here, and an object that is the side and the hands must be at or close to the floor. Also, the biomechanical consequences are really of a concern here. Increased spinal compression force is caused by a larger amount of torso co-contraction that would be expected if the lift were performed in a more symmetric fashion in a sagittal plane versus to the side. Now, shown in this figure, the predicted L4, L5 disc compression force is quite high in the asymmetric posture as we see it, in contrast to the sagittal plane that we talked about earlier. A second biomechanical consequence of this side lifting posture is that it induces a complex shearing force and an axial torque loading on the spinal motion segments. Although actual specific failure limits for these stressors have not been established, there are studies that indicate that an increase of low back pain exists in this type of asymmetric lifting. Finally, as depicted in this scenario, the lifting strength is compromised when a side lift is attempted. Now, researchers have disclosed that an average of 15% decrease in maximal acceptable weights subjects chose to lift at their side as compared to the lift in front of the body. The combination of the biomechanical and strength effects resulted in the revised guidelines that I discussed earlier, and also their recommendation that weights lifted at the side of the body reduced by 30% of the recommended weight lifted in the sagittal plane. Okay, so let's summarize here by listing some adverse postures that happen during lifting. I guess first, though, let's discuss that the postures really that one must be using are not really dictated by the employee, but dictated to a large extent by the workplace layout and size and the shape of the object that the employee has to lift. So many common work conditions can produce the postures that are highly stressful, especially to the low back region, as we discussed earlier. Now, in this context, the first corrective action is to basically evaluate the workspace with specific emphasis on those lifting tasks that contain one or more of the following adverse postural requirements. So we're in the adverse here first. First of all, a heavy, bulky object that is lying on the floor. Second, an object, for example, a box that doesn't have a well-designed handle or any handles at all that allow the hands a good power grasp throughout the lifting motion. Another adverse effect here would be an object that's stored near the back of the deep shelf and really cannot be easily pulled close to the body. Well, let's say, for example, a barrier causes a large horizontal distance between the torso of the employee and the object. And finally, the objects that are stored near the floor or under or around benches or shelves that force asymmetric lifting postures, as we discussed in the side lifting procedure earlier. So obviously, the intent of such evaluations should be to ergonomically redesign the workplace and the object, so the worker is presented packages to be lifted that have maybe the following characteristics. They allow a person to keep the torso near a vertical. For example, keeping the object lifted close to the body and near hip height. Also, avoid having to re-grasp the object during the lift motion, as we discussed before. And avoid the torso twisting or side bending lifts. So if redesign of the workplace and or the packages is not feasible, which sometimes it can't be, material handling devices, for instance, a hoist, articulated arms, robotic arms may be a good alternative if at all possible. Although often requiring more time to move an object than necessary when you do manual lifting, these devices can be very effective in reducing the stresses and thereby reducing workplace injuries. And finally, all the workers involved in lifting objects, especially heavy objects in the industry, need to be formally trained. Such of this emphasis needs the following at a minimum. So number one, stepping close to an object before beginning the lift, even straddling the object if possible, or pulling the object in close before you do the lift. Number two, facing the object to balance the load with both hands while lifting. Number three, planning or visualizing the lift trajectory to ensure that the object can set down close to the body. Number four, designating a specific place to set the object down, avoiding high lifts and re-grasping of the object to reach the set down area. And five, using correct fitting gloves to provide a firmer grasp of the object if gloves are available. Additional focuses on training would involve prearranging the objects being lifted so that the heavier objects are always at hip-waist height and easily reached, for example, close to the torso. Orienting objects long in one direction so that the largest dimension is vertical, so instead of horizontal. Now, if carrying an object, making sure that the walking area is clear and has a uniform, level, high-traction surface. Also, knowing one load's lifting capacity. For example, the strength, and making sure that the objects being lifted are not really stressful to the employee, and getting help if needed. And finally, if the lifts are frequent, maybe alternating lifting with the lighter work and taking frequent recovery breaks. These are just a few of many that can be at least instituted or discussed with the employee and the employer. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's presentation and you were able to glean some information from it. So in conclusion, let's just talk about this. The postural lifting requirements really are only one source of injurious stress to the back in our industries. Both ergonomic design and worker training issues must be considered in order to reduce the postural stresses in many different jobs. Now, it's hoped that this information will assist people and especially employers in providing one part of a comprehensive program needed to prevent occupational low back pain. So I'm Dr. Chris Rapoff, and I wanted to thank you for taking the time to join me in this presentation today. I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to sharing other interesting subjects as they relate to disorders that the workers encounter in the workplace. Until next time, thank you.